Once, about 100 years ago, there was a village in Alaska. And in that village, there lived wolves and a hunter and fishermen and the chief of the village and the women of the village and an old woman who lived all alone. Once, about 100 years ago, in the morning, it had been a very hard winter without very much food for anyone to eat, and everyone in the village was hungry. The hunters were out hunting with their wolves, and the fishermen were out fishing, trying to pull in any food for the village, when all of a sudden the wolves caught something.
Well, that's the biggest muscat I've ever seen. Let's go take it to the chief.
And they took it to the chief of the village. The wolves pulling the sled. Whoa. It was very slippery in the snow. And then at the same moment of good fortune, the fishermen.
This fish will feed the whole village.
And the chief said, so they all began to prepare for the feast. But there was one old woman in the village who didn't come to help prepare for the feast. You guys come on over more around the fire. So we've got room over in front of the old woman. And the two women went to her house to find out why the old woman wasn't coming to the feast. And they found her crying. And so they left the poor lonely woman in her igloo and went back to help with the feast. And the old woman was so lonely, she went walking down by the ocean. It was freezing cold and the sun was starting to set, when all of a sudden she noticed a lump of white on the sand. She went over. It was a baby polar bear. So she took the polar bear back to the village, and the wolves came running out to defend their friends from the beasts that had entered their village. And the polar bear and the wolves put their heads down, which is what dogs do when they want to show they're ready to be friends. And the polar bear put its head down, and they sniffed. And with that, just the way animals can do it, they became friends. And they started chasing each other round and round in a circle. But the chief of the village came over and said,
"What have you got here?" "Be nice, it's just the way. I'll let you keep it, so you keep it under control."
Say that again, I was in your way.
"I'll let you keep it as long as you keep it under control."
So she said she would, and all the villagers went back to their igloos. Except the wolves kept playing with, and as time went by, they fed the polar bear, and the wolves and the polar bear became friends, and all the women in the village were feeding the bear, and the children were playing with it, and everybody loved the polar bear, except that it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and stronger, until one day when the polar bear and the wolves were playing together, the polar bear didn't know its own strength, and it hurt one of its friends by accident, and all the villagers came running. And the chief of the village said,
"I said you can only keep it as long as you keep it under control."
and all the villagers huddled together with the chief. The old woman took the polar bear into the igloo. The polar bear's name was Kunik. And the next time the polar bear came out to play, they came out of hiding and surrounded it with spears. They had their weapons ready, and the polar bear cried, "Stop!" And the chief said, "You get rid of it."
You get rid of it, we'll do it for you.
And they went back to their igloos. And the old woman said to her polar bear,
I love you, but you have to go.
she knew she couldn't keep it safe. And she was so sad, and the poor polar bear was so sad, it left the village quickly. Slowly. Oh, the poor old woman cried and cried. But what was even worse was all the villagers were angry with her. So the women of the village ignored her. And no one brought her food anymore because she had endangered the tribe. And she was hungry and lonely and sad. So one night, she left the igloo.
Good
And she went looking for her polar bear. She walked up and down. Go on. But she couldn't find him. And finally, she was so cold and hungry, she lay down on the beach and thought, well, I'm old, I'm tired, I'll go to sleep. I don't care. And then, suddenly, as soon as they're all together in bed, she heard there was a whole family of polar bears. And they were sniffing. She was afraid they were going to eat her. She tried to run away, but the lead polar bear, the head of the family, ran up and threw its paws around her. It was her very own baby. And now her baby had a village of polar bears. And they brought her food to eat. And they were all friends, and they made her part of their family because she had been so kind and was the mother to their leader. And then after the woman had eaten and felt stronger, she said to her polar bear,
I'll have to go. I might freeze out here.
"But come visit me," she said.
But come visit me.
And the polar bear told her that he would every day. And they said goodbye again, but now they weren't so sad because they knew they would see each other. And the polar bear family went back to its cave, and they, every morning after that, I gave them time to make the change. The polar bears left, and the old woman went back to her village. But now, she wasn't so lonely and sad, because now every morning, her polar bear came just before the sun rose and brought her fish and meat so that she was never hungry. And it would sit with her until the sun came up, and then it would leave so that the villagers wouldn't find it there. And she wasn't lonely anymore. But the villagers saw everything that was happening, and they watched how the polar bear came every day and brought food to its mother. And finally, one day, all the villagers went to the old woman's igloo, and they told her they were sorry. And the chief of the village said,
We'll never kill another polar bear again.
and that's why there is one village in Alaska that if you go there, you will find that they are friends with the polar bear, and they never kill them, they never hurt them, and they know that they help each other be safe and strong. They always remember the love of the old woman and her baby polar bear.